All right, guys. Closing Keynote with a legend in the industry. I think anybody that's been in the business knows Mike Sepso. Please join us. Big hand for Mike. Now, Mike came and kicked off our SVG Summit last December. That's our largest event in New York. Shameless plug if you guys find yourself in New York next month. And he was late. He was like really late, and we started freaking out, and we couldn't figure out why. And this is a real story. You were stranded behind camels on Broadway, right? What was it again?
It was 49th Street, but they were bringing camels in to do a Christmas skit for the Tonight Show. For
Fallon, right. So no camels this time. He's on time. He got here early just in case there was any kind of camel-related endeavors. But so in 2002, Mike, founded Major League Gaming, co-founded Major League Gaming, which obviously a massive step forward in the industry, probably the largest early esports, organization. And then, you jumped on at Activision Blizzard, which then acquired MLG and helped to launch, where they are today in terms of Overwatch League and their other esports efforts. Now the next chapter for you, sir. It's coming along. We were able to get Mike in just after a recent announcement. He's launching Vindex with a bunch of other big names from our industry as well as the traditional sports industry and big media. And as part of that, acquired Next Generation Esports, which we had Andrew from NGE join us earlier today, as well as launching Esports Engine. So before we get into all that, because it is a super, very interesting new effort, and I'm curious about what exactly you think it means for the business, but let's go back to 2002. Because I was so far removed from anything that could possibly be what esports has come today. What was it like at that point? Why did you see an opening for MLG? Why did it make sense to launch something like that, especially that early? And what were the next few years like after you did launch it?
Well, the word esports didn't exist yet.
Right.
So that was one thing. I think it was like 5 years later. We, it really came out of sort of a love for gaming and just being competitive. And being sports fans and former athletes, and then finding out that there were these sort of grassroots tournaments happening across the country. Then we realized there was some sort of real production and investment behind the sport being created in South Korea, primarily out of StarCraft. So we looked at that and we said, this is pretty amazing that there's already a cable network that's doing 24/7 programming for StarCraft competitions. But if you saw it, if you go back and sort of YouTube or Google late 90s, early 2000s StarCraft competitions in Korea, it's different.
Right, to say the least, yeah.
It didn't look like something that would play here, right, next to other pro sports. So we looked at it, we said, first of all, StarCraft's an amazing game, but it's a computer game, and at that time, people were more console-oriented in the West. Mobile wasn't even a thing yet. YouTube wasn't actually a thing yet.
Right.
So we decided, effectively, how do we take this, apply it to games that people in the Western world, especially in the US, play. We happened to be playing Halo a lot at that time. It was a great multiplayer game, the first Halo. So we started there, and we actually, it was nice for the last panel to be the real pro sports guys, because we based the whole league on NASCAR, actually. So we just basically said, how do we take what they're doing in Korea, apply it to a different type of game, make it a team sport, and then make it so you could see, Bud Light and chicken wings kind of.
Wear the logos. Yeah, let's get the logos on there. So it's a ridiculous question to ask, but I think you're one of the few people that can answer it. How does that compare to where we are today? And I mean, we're talking going to Mars versus learning how to, go from amoebas coming out of the water at this, right?
Yeah. I would say that, there's been some 2 or 3, I'll probably miss some things because I've forgotten a lot of stuff in 17 years. I gained weight and gray hairs and lost memories, but I would say the first major revolution came when we started MLG. We had previously worked in very early internet video streaming. So we had some ideas about how to do that, but it was wildly expensive to broadcast on the internet yourself. And then sort of YouTube, then Justin TV, which eventually became Twitch, gave us opportunities to distribute for free, which that was sort of the first wave of the capability to create lots of content and push it out there. And this has always been a digitally native customer base or consumer base.
Right.
And so being able to connect with people directly through those channels was really good. Unfortunately, that lasted a couple of years, and then we realized those platforms really don't care about making money. And we are spending millions of dollars to create content as rights holder. How do we monetize this? So, but that was the first sort of like push into what esports could become, and there all of a sudden became just a lot of content consumption. And then the second thing is, MLG, I started the esports division at Activision Blizzard in early or mid 2015. And that really happened because of lots of conversations with Bobby Kotick. And I said, he was like, how come you guys have been doing this? You built a really cool business. How come it hasn't become huge already? Because I know how big our games are. And the answer was because the league operator and the sort of media behind the league and the rights holder were different, right? And so the difference between esports and traditional sports, the only difference that you really need to care about is traditional sports are public domain, esports are played on somebody's IP. The playing field is somebody's actual owned piece of software or entertainment. And
nobody owns football.
Nobody owns football. You and I could go start a football league tomorrow. I think Vince McMahon's trying again.
Everybody's starting a football league, right and left. They're popping up everywhere.
They can't stop you, but they can stop you from doing an Overwatch league. You can't go create an Overwatch league. So I said, and he said, well, what would you do if it was all housed in one place? And I said, there's like what I've been saying to people in the esports world, and as many people in the audience who've been around as long as I have, I'm the suit in esports, right? I'm the corporate guy that's been trying to make it a business for 17 years. And I said, we don't need to reinvent sports. Sports picked a model. It doesn't matter if you're playing hockey, basketball, or football. There's a great model for it. It's called a franchise league system. You make lots of money. You have a sort of fixed real estate. Every team owner owns a city and something, and it just builds. So all we really need to do is steal all the best parts of that structure, realize that this is not a pure franchise league system because there's a commercial owner of the sport, but let's build that. So we started to create the blueprint for what that is, and then that became the Overwatch League.
And here we are,
Call of Duty League.
Yeah, now Call of Duty coming,
So I think the major difference is in the past, now, I guess, 3 years since we announced Overwatch League, a lot of people in this room probably wouldn't be here if there wasn't a franchise system. And quickly, Riot adopted a franchise model, and it's really perpetuating now throughout the industry. But what that created was stability, and for the first time, really, a thesis for institutional capital to come into the space. And so within about 2 years of the announcement of the Overwatch League, almost $1 billion in capital came into esports.
Right. Yeah. There's a path, right? And therefore that's when the dollar signs come in. So we'll get a little bit more into how that's going to continue to evolve, but let's briefly talk about Vindex. What is it? Why are you launching it? And what does it mean for the industry?
Yeah. So I think, as I left Activision Blizzard at the end of my contract a year ago, I realized we had created something great, which was really structure, and they could apply it to any game that had real competitive capability to it, and that there was nothing proprietary about that model. It would be replicated throughout the industry because it was, after helping design the system, once we were getting ready to launch the league, I took over all the global commercial operations. And I never sold so much sponsorship so quickly.
Right.
It was amazing. And it continues to be. It's far and away, it doesn't have the biggest audience. You can argue it's not the best game. Overwatch, I think it's a great game. But it commercially just crushes everything else out there. And I think that's largely because of the structure that it was created on, and then the level of resource and investment Activision Blizzard puts behind it. But that being said, that's kind of now been invented. And I'm not a big company guy. I'm an entrepreneur. So the next opportunity that was obvious to me was if everyone in the industry, if the rights holders, the publishers are going to gravitate towards a very successful commercial pro league structure, they're going to need a lot of resources to be able to do that. And it's kind of like going from late 1960s, maybe early 1960s NBA to late 90s, early 2000s NBA in about 18 months. So if you think about it, none of the infrastructure was there, right? Even the traditional broadcasters who ESPN got all excited about it, wanted to broadcast it, can't. How do you,
Right.
It's easy to produce Monday Night Football if you're ESPN. How do you do the Fortnite World Cup? You have no idea. So who's going to do that? Well, as it turns out, there's a company called NGE, 15 minutes away from here, who very quietly built an incredible, successful business, has invented more technology in the past 5 years than I think the industry has in a long time. That was a starting point. And also coming available was a lot of people were from our former production team at MLG were starting to leave Activision and wanted to create their own business again in Columbus, Ohio. So our broader thesis was, how do we use sort of who we are in the industry, which is luckily, you can't spend 17 years in any industry and not make some enemies, but mostly have friends. And so we have, pretty credible reputation. Sundance, who's the other co-founder, and I had this idea that was, let's go try to raise lots of capital and build big businesses to supply infrastructure and do the stuff that's not very sexy, but really necessary, and try to make it as big and as global as possible, as quickly as possible, so that companies like EA and Microsoft and Sony and Activision and others can rely on one big partner to execute what they're doing globally. That led us to obviously looking at NGE and financing the spin out from the former MLG team. But we're also looking at lots of other infrastructure plays. And I think the interesting thing from a technology point of view, and one of the things I didn't hear on the last panel is, the difference between professional sports, traditional league sports, or even NASCAR production for television versus esports is these companies like NGE, like Esports Engine in Columbus, they're tech companies.
Right.
Yep. They're not, it's not, directors aren't the divas that you have in pro sports. And look, I got the opportunity to work with Steve Bornstein at Activision, who is the chairman of my division, who's there is nobody more legendary in sports broadcast. And he looked at it right away and said, this is totally different. This has nothing to do with, you might have a camera and some lights, but that's the only thing that looks familiar to me. The rest of this is technology. So being able to invest deeply in that technology, being able to productize it, being able to make it more accessible. So as these new pro leagues are being developed, we can innovate and create great content and do it, all over the world.
So let's talk about when this infrastructure continues to, be facilitated by you guys, potentially new leagues, properties growing, that type of thing. Yes, it's a rapidly growing business, but no, I don't think that it's necessarily a mainstream audience yet. If anybody saw the SNL skit a few weeks ago, the difference between an esports fan and a regular sports fan. So I'm curious. What do you expect now for the next couple of years? Do you think that this type of investment is the key, where this investment will come, the properties, the leagues, the infrastructure will grow, and then we start seeing mass adoption, mass fan bases?
So one, what we're here to do with Vindex is build big global companies that help support the growth, right? So we're not going to be a league,
sure,
but
right.
We hope to help, design and produce and execute every league. We hope to be a great partner to
the foundation
leagues.
that it's built on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We also hope to supply the infrastructure for amateur players to become pro players. We hope to do a lot of those things. Where I think, though, I guess I have a different point of view on how big this is because I have a 17-year perspective.
Right.
Not 2 years. So maybe I'm a little more patient. But it's, I think if you were to look at using sort of like traditional media metrics or frame of view, if you look at the population, take the population of North Americans under 30, there is a very high penetration rate of esports fans in that group. If you take the North American population over 40, there's me and like 5 guys in this room.
And go even lower, and it's even higher, right? Under 20 is even, continues. Yeah.
So I think what I've seen for 17 years is effectively a generational wave. Like Sundance's 16-year-old has grown up thinking that esports was a thing just like baseball his whole life. That's been sort of our bar. Sundance had a kid like the day after we started MLG, which is stressful.
Right, yeah, I'm sure.
But yeah, I mean, like that generation has grown up with it. So 16-year-olds and younger, this has always been a thing.
Yeah.
It's never not been a thing. And, lots of them think Ninja is cooler and more famous than LeBron James.
Right.
And it's hard to argue that he may not be 10 years from now.
Yeah, and I guess I mean that there's no question the viewership is there. There's no question that it's rising. But as you mentioned with Overwatch, where the sponsorship, just uber sponsorship because of the structure, are we going to see more of that traditional investment, media rights sales? I'm extremely curious about what this next round of potential media rights sales are going to be as these new leagues launch.
I think so. The only thing I would warn against is like every single data point is not a binary decision-making outcome on the health of the industry.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a big industry now, and don't forget, this is an industry being built on the most successful part of the entertainment industry globally. Right. I think I just saw yesterday that on CNBC they revised. I think it was Goldman, or it might have been a Newsy study, but they revised up the size of the 2019 global video game revenue from 152 to 174 billion dollars. The delta in that forecast increase is bigger than the global music business.
Wow.
So you're talking about like the biggest thing in the world, and then you're building a new thing on top of it. Mm-hmm. It's going to be successful. It's going to take time, and sports take a long time to build. That's what's happening. So it's not going to happen. It's not a tech business per se, and that it's not going to take off like Instagram. But it's a big business, and there are now billions of dollars being invested in it. And it's pretty clear that the core industry itself, a huge portion of it is being pulled in the direction of competition in esports and social platforms, right? So I think of Fortnite, for instance, it's a great competitive game, it's really fun to watch. It's a social network.
Yeah, yep, yeah, no question. First and foremost, and a competition much later. Any questions out there? Everybody's excited for beers. Got it. Okay, cool. I am curious about churn for games. I mean, this has been a concern, I think, for a lot of people, is the concept of esports having a future. I think a lot of people are behind. What those games are going to be and how it's sustainable, building a league around a game. I'm sure that's a conversation you had time and time again as you guys were launching. How is the industry going to adapt as new titles come out, as titles age, as titles evolve? How do you kind of see that playing out?
So I think the franchise league systems and sort of what's happening at the top of the professional esports world now is also recognition by the big game publishers that games have changed from something that looked like the movie business into something that looks like a social network business. The games are platforms that will persist for forever. And I think, Bobby Kotick said when we were announcing the Overwatch League in one of his interviews, we're making perpetual partnerships. These are forever deals, right? These are not, the Overwatch League, if you bought an Overwatch League franchise, you have a deal that exists for forever. It doesn't go away, which means they're making the commitment to support that game as a platform for that competitive league for forever. And I think that was a huge statement for the longest running CEO in the industry to make, as the head of the biggest independent game publisher in the world, to make that statement. It's a really big, and he wasn't saying it as part of, it wasn't an Overwatch conversation, it was an Overwatch League conversation.
Philosophical, yeah,
He's
right.
saying this is changing. So I think if you look at how games work now, and especially with new business models like free-to-play and certainly like Fortnite or even League of Legends, like that game, these are games that there's no reason they shouldn't live forever. And when you're not worried about a narrative storyline staying fresh, when you're not really making a movie, you're just making a competitive platform, a social platform, you're creating something where people interact with each other. It really does look more like an extraordinarily rich, interesting environment that's effectively a social competitive platform. Okay. So I think that's kind of where games are headed, and I think largely that's due to the consumer sort of pulling, the core consumer in the gaming business pulled the whole industry into esports. And this is a sort of reflection of that.
Right. Wow, very exciting to see where that goes. But I'm curious, 2020. Give me one or two crystal ball predictions. It can be Vindex related. It can be not Vindex related. What do you think is going to happen? Because you saw this well before anybody else did. So I'm anticipating you can make money for everybody in this room by these next 2 statements, please.
I guess I think industry-wide we will see. I think we'll finally start to see the sort of end of the conversations about in the more mainstream part of culture. Not just is esports here to stay, but like where does it fit? I think we're going to start to understand as a culture in the West. And one of the things I've always loved about esports is we usually think of things as being invented here and then growing and scaling in places like China. It's the total opposite.
Right.
Came from there. North America is the growth market for esports right now, which is an amazing opportunity. I think it will start to fit better into the overall popular culture or the mainstream culture of our world. So I think that will change a lot of things about how we talk about esports and how we understand it commercially. Vindex, we launched a few weeks ago, and we did what was effectively a $60 million seed round. So I think we're going to raise a lot more money and buy a lot more companies.
Very cool. All right, I like it. Before I thank this guy right here, I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to make sure that you all go to New York City on December 16th and 17th for the SVG Summit. It's our biggest event. We have an esports element in the program, so please check it out. And check out sportsvideo.org for all of our events throughout the year. We do more than a dozen here and half a dozen in Europe. But first and foremost, Mike Sepso, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.